A title: Mandatory Reporting Policies. Alicia Aiken, Executive Director, the Confidentiality Institute.
In terms of thinking about policies for an advocacy organization around mandatory reporting, first off, make sure you know what your law actually is. Second, make sure you know what professions are actually being practiced in your organization. And that might sound like an obvious question, but since many people who work in advocacy have a social work background, sometimes it's unclear about whether or not they are currently practicing social work or whether they are currently practicing a profession that is required to make mandatory reports. So just because someone has a bachelor's of social work does not mean that they are a licensed social worker. So step number one is be very clear about what your local law is, and step number two is be very clear about what are the professions that are actually working in your organization. And then have clear training and standard language for your staff to use about how do you alert people, how and when do you alert people who are contacting you about your mandatory reporting requirements, and then have a clear policy about what to do if you receive information that you think would require a mandatory report. What action does the advocate take next? And this is an important place to be aware of what are the time requirements. Many statutes will just say that you have to immediately take action, but they won't define what immediately means, or some will say immediately, but if you look more closely, the definition is within 24 hours. And so you want to make sure that people have a sense of how much time do they have before they are legally required to make a phone call, and how are you going to use that time to be survivor-centered, to be safety-centered. And that's an important element that people need to do safety planning around what it means to be making a mandatory report. If someone comes to you for help and they are an older adult living with the person who is harming them, and you say, I'm going to have to make a report, they need to know, does this mean that the person who I live with, who is harming with me, is about to get a phone call or a visit from the police? And if it does mean that in your state, then where do I sleep safely tonight? Or how do I deal with the consequences of reporting one of my children when the other 4 of my children are going to be angry and feel betrayed with me for impacting the family? So there's both safety planning means both what keeps your physical body safe and also what keeps you emotionally safe. And I think the what keeps you emotionally safe is going to be highly defined by the person who is in front of you, which is why the question, what worries you about what will happen next, is such an important question.
Brandl, Director, National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, End Domestic Abuse, Wisconsin.
So a couple scenarios to keep in mind. There's mandatory reporting for elder abuse and mandatory reporting for vulnerable adults, depending on the state that you live in. So in some states, the only cases that need to be reported are vulnerable adults, folks who are not able to report themselves or protect themselves. Most of the folks that come to a domestic violence program may not meet that definition of an APS client. And so really learning that definition and talking to Adult Protective Services to sort out what cases might need to be reported. But many older adults may work with a domestic violence program and an APS report is not required at all. In other states, it's an age-based definition. And then a second thing to think about is who needs to report. So in some states, there's a very specific list of who needs to be is a reporter, and a domestic violence or sexual assault advocate may or may not be on that list, or may not have those professional credentials that mean that they're a mandated reporter. In other states, everyone in the entire state is a mandated reporter. And so, again, looking at how that law is written and how that impacts your policies and your practice. And then, of course, your agency policies on confidentiality, on privilege, and how all of these laws and policies intersect. It's really crucial to have spent the time proactively figuring these steps out, having a policy in place, identifying if there is a specific staff person who's designated to make the report, or if anyone on staff can make the report. And then what do you do before, during, and after if you need to make a report? So if you're talking to an older adult and you suspect you might be a mandated reporter, providing information up front so that that victim can choose the information that she shares and know what might happen if she provides some information that you may need to make a report. So saying something up front. If you identify that you need to make a report, talking to her to preserve as much autonomy as possible. Is she interested or willing to make the call herself? Does she want to be in the room while you call and make the report? Having conversations about the impact and then being there with her throughout the entire process if in any way that works for her. So if she is interested in having you be there when she's interviewed, when other steps might happen, at least offering that as a resource.
Logos appear. NCALL, www.ncall.us. Terra Nova Films, terranova.org. Funded by the U.S. Department of Justice, Office on Violence Against Women and Elder Justice Initiative. www.justice.gov/elderjustice. A disclaimer. This project was supported by grant number 2014 AXTA K050, awarded by the Office on Violence Against Women and by the Elder Justice Initiative, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this program are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice, Office on Violence Against Women, or the Elder Justice Initiative.